We're privileged to have two great speakers, both of whom I know pretty well. Starting out with Arthi Prabhakar, who was local, raised in Texas, but grew up around here as an adult and lives in Palo Alto, or is it Menlo Park, Arthi? I think Palo Alto. I think you walked here, right? Okay. But Arthi has been a trailblazer in so many ways and in so many jobs. She ran the National Institute of Standards and Technology. She ran DARPA. You've heard of DARPA. All sorts of amazing technologies coming out of that. Most recently, she was at the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, OSTP, pretty big deal, and was a science advisor to the president. Got her PhD at Caltech. One story that tells you a lot about Arthi is when she was going to get Senate confirmed, the Senate staffer who was preparing her for confirmation, Professor Wyndham, who's here at Stanford, you may have taken some of his classes. Well, he not only prepared her for confirmation, he prepared her for a life together with 2 kids. So they actually got married, so kind of a cool story. And also another friend of mine, Vivek Viswanathan, he's a CPR policy fellow, right? CPR policy. Best known for getting a JD MBA here at Stanford, which is pretty cool. So that's actually, we met when you were still in school here, and I saw him recently at Aspen. But also served in the White House with Arthi. I was on the National Economic Council, worked in the White House Chief of Staff's office, which must have been crazy, center of the universe. Little story about him, for President Biden, when they were worried about the gas prices, you took that whole portfolio on and became known as Biden's gas man, as I understand it. So you may have known him from that fame, maybe if some of you remember that. But Arthi and Vivek, thanks for joining us. Ernestine's going to provide some moderating efforts, and Eric's going to do a wrap-up, but Arthi and Vivek, thanks so much for joining us. Please.
Arthi, maybe we'll start with just talking a little bit about public-private partnerships, and I feel like you've been on multiple sides. One thing that Joe didn't mention in the intro is, in addition to being inside government, DARPA, NIST, OSTP, also you were in the private sector, also at U.S. Venture Partners, venture capital firm here. Maybe we could just kick off with what do you think makes a public-private partnership actually work versus just being a nice idea on paper?
Well, first of all, it's great to be here with both of you, and I'm really excited to hear from this amazing group of students you have here and other folks. So that's a term, public-private partnerships, that gets put onto a lot of different arrangements. But let me step back and just say, my hair was once black, and the way it got white is over 4 decades of working on science and technology and innovation. And I'm at the point where it's about half public sector and half private sector. The private sector part was all right here in Silicon Valley. And the thing that I just keep thinking about is how big the things are that this country's been able to accomplish. I think about the electronics that made all of this possible. I think about how we responded to the pandemic with an mRNA vaccine that was the fastest, most effective vaccine ever developed. I think about just simple things like you can take a sip of tap water and not worry about it. These are all things that we did as a country because of science, technology, and innovation. Every single one of those took public investment and it took private sector action. And so to me, that's the partnership I really care about, is how do we make sure that public and private keep playing their individual roles. Sometimes they do it together, and that certainly happened in my time when I was running programs at DARPA. Typically, I'd be investing in some advanced semiconductor devices, and I would be funding basic research in universities and some early work in companies. And sometimes the university stuff would lead to spin out. So it can happen in a lot of different ways. Sometimes it happens together, sometimes it happens serially. So I don't think there's just one recipe.
Yeah.
What I really care about is how do we make sure we keep the whole system healthy. And right now it's at risk, and I think that's a great concern. Both pieces depend on each other, and right now, as part of the crisis that our country is in, our science and technology system is at a quite grave risk.
Maybe we could dive into the mRNA vaccine. You mentioned that briefly. I feel like that's a powerful example where decades of NIH-funded sort of basic research suddenly became critical for COVID.
That's actually not how it happened. That's not how it happened at all.
Well, tell us.
That might be their story. That's not actually how it happened.
Tell us how it happened.
So here's how it happened. I'll start in the middle of the story, of the mRNA story. I showed up at DARPA in 2012 as the director. I had been there many years earlier as a program manager, started a semiconductor office. I was gone for 19 years and I came back. I was so thrilled to get to come back and run this agency that I had loved. I was getting to know my program managers because, a few things had changed in 20 years and all kinds of amazing new research projects were underway. One of my program managers said he was an epidemiologist, an infectious disease doc, a PhD, MD, and an Air Force colonel, because that's what DARPA is like. And he said, this is 2012, he said there's going to be another pandemic because all the conditions are right. People in the infectious disease world knew it. We were all living in blissful ignorance. And he said one of the big problems is it takes years or decades or never to make a vaccine that works. And he said there's this research in mRNA that could be the basis for a rapid response vaccine platform. Now, I can't tell you how crazy this was in 2012. Infamously, Katie Carrico and Drew Weissman, who recently won the Nobel Prize for that very early research, their story is how they couldn't get funded by NIH or anyone else to do that, right? So it was actually it was a crazy idea. We didn't think it was impossible, and the whole point of having a DARPA is to do things that are out of the mainstream, but if they work, they can change the game. Dan went on to say that he had just met a company called Moderna, that they a brand new startup up in the Boston area, that they were working on mRNA for cancer. And Dan said, maybe we can persuade them to work on infectious disease. And this is the magic, right? When you have a big vision of something transformative and the dollars to make things move, that's what it took. It wasn't easy because if I had been the VC on their board, I probably would have objected to chasing. Who knows if we're going to have an infectious disease opportunity? We know we're going to have, tragically, cancer is the predictable market, right? So we did persuade them. A lot of miracles had to happen. A lot of amazing science and innovation had to happen. And then a mobilization to reach everyone in the pandemic. The piece of the puzzle that we made happen was the fact that Moderna was able to ship doses of COVID-19 vaccines for clinical trials 42 days after the spike protein on the virus was sequenced. And that was probably my best, all I did was say yes to a crazy program manager, but I did my job that day.
No, it's an incredible story. Maybe we could talk about also just on the chip innovation side as well. You were leading DARPA during this sort of crucial period of chip innovation. You were also at NIST, leading NIST during some of the early semiconductor advances. And I guess, can you walk through how maybe some of the federal investments actually translated into the chips that now power kind of like smartphones, iPads, and that sort of?
There's a very deep history that goes all the way back to the very earliest days. I mean, integrated circuits, the very first customers for integrated circuits back in the late 50s and early 60s were the government and the Defense Department and the space program, of course. In the time that I was there, the kinds of technologies that we were working on were advanced gallium arsenide technology, which is still in the power amp in many phones. That's the radio chip that's talking to the cell tower, the lithography technology that makes all the advanced chips. I funded the 193 nanometer lithography technology from sort of crazy idea to de facto roadmap technology. I think it was 5 generations of chips that were built based on that technology. Those were important because they had huge economic implications. They helped drive Moore's Law forward. They helped American companies, like I keep pointing to your device, but everyone's got one in their hand. I'm feeling twitchy because I don't have mine, it's over there. But that's what Steve Jobs took and put these miraculous products together. That's what so many other companies and then industries built on top of. And then, the reason we were doing it in the Defense Department was for our military. And I have heard a soldier say that he carried comms and nav gear in his backpack instead of food and water because it was more important to him on patrols. And when I heard that, I knew that we had done our job, 20 years earlier, because that was the point of the exercises. Instead of a GPS receiver being the size of a closet and only fitting on a large ship, that was now something, he could carry, but that we can all carry too.
Yeah. Maybe we could talk a little bit about AI. I feel like it's a
There's a
topic that everyone's thinking about. Both of you, Vivek, Arthi, you worked on the executive order on AI, probably one of the most comprehensive policy frameworks any government has put forward, establishing AI safety standards, kind of governance framework. I guess, Vivek, what was the thinking behind putting together that framework and also just such a broad framework as well during your time at the White House?
Absolutely. And so I think, when AI has been on our minds, on the government's mind for a long time, it's not something that just emerged at the end of 2022. But when that latest iteration of ChatGPT came out, captured all this attention, adding millions and millions of users, I think more and more people across the country, across the world, and across the US government got a sense of just how applicable this technology could be in so many different fields. And there's always a question with any issue on regulation, what you're supposed to do, right? There's some issues where there might be some problems to be monitoring, but you generally want to let things go. There are other issues where they're incredibly serious and you actually want to slow or potentially even pause development until you have a better sense of what's actually happening. And then there are those issues that are somewhere in the middle. And so I think we looked at AI as a place that's somewhere in the middle. On the one hand, we had people telling us, and I think these voices have actually gotten a little bit louder in the years since, saying, hey, it's technology, it's math, let it go, and then simply classify penalize the misuse of it and not look at the development of it in any way. And on the other hand, we had people who say, some of you may remember that famous petition that came out, I think in 2023, which says we need a 6-month pause, a freeze on this technology, no further development. And you can kind of see, when you think about technologies that could be used for good or ill, on the one hand, you have a butter knife, which nobody's really going to regulate. On the other hand, you have nuclear weapons, which if someone says, hey, don't worry if it spreads, we'll just punish a country if it uses it, you can see how that could be problematic if more and more countries are developing it. And so that was basically the challenge. I think the good thing that happened at the time was the companies, at least to us, were saying, we actually want some measure of regulation. Of course, different companies had a different view of what that should look like, but there was a sense that if you let this Wild West run, that could create problems, not just for the society, but for the companies themselves. Because as a company, even though regulation can be difficult, regulation is never perfect and there can always be issues, you actually want to be encouraged to do the right thing, because otherwise it creates a race to the bottom. And we see that in other contexts in business, right? Where when you have a law or regulation that prevents bribing government officials or foreign officials in other countries, that is a regulation, but it actually makes your life easier as a product leader or as a CEO, as a business person, because when you choose to do the right thing and not bribe somebody, you don't have to worry that someone else is actually going to take the low road and get ahead of you. So that was the general thought. We want to put a framework around this. And what we started with, and Arthi was a key part of this, was what are these companies willing to do voluntarily? And they can all come together, know it's in their interest, agree to a set of commitments. That over time evolved into the executive order. And I think most folks would agree that what you would want on top of that is a wise and meaningful regulatory scheme. And that's the part we haven't seen yet. But that was the goal that we were working toward.
Yeah. In this whole process, how did you bring different stakeholders around the table? What was that process like?
So
Oh my God.
I will talk about it, and then Arthi.
This is what we got to work on together. So I want to hear your answer, Vivek.
Yes. So I think the one thing that all of you have probably learned about AI is everybody has an opinion on it. Everybody has something that they want to say, and that's important because ultimately, just to zoom out for a second, there are so many challenges, as Arthi alluded to, with our democracy and how politics is practiced in the country. But if you had to isolate one of the major ones, it's a sense that people feel like they don't have a voice. They don't feel like they have a say in the forces that govern their lives. And so when you're embarking on a big new policy challenge, something like this, you want to try to create an environment where you can challenge that presumption and make people feel better about the conversation that's happening. And also, to the extent possible, depolarize it, where it's not seen as a Democratic or Republican issue. So of course, in a issue like this, you have the big companies themselves, and there was actually, even within that, a question of if the White House says we're gathering the leading AI companies, well, every company out there wants to be designated as a leading AI company. And you run against both logistical, how many chairs can you actually fit in the room, but also the fact that some of these companies maybe have not done as much to incorporate AI into their products, but want to be seen as such by their investors. And so there was the challenge of navigating that. There was the challenge that Aarti took a leading role in, among many others, across the US government. R&D, of course, you have NIH, you have NSF, you have the Defense Department, but when you actually think about it, research and development, Department of Energy, is happening in so many different places across the federal government. They all have a stake. And then you have folks who rightly feel that what we saw with social media, where there wasn't a lot of regulation and a lot of people on both sides of the aisle were unhappy, folks who felt like they might be harmed again wanted to make sure that they weren't left out. So when it comes to bias, comes to discrimination, comes to how it changes the jobs and economic environment, those folks all wanted to make sure, and we wanted to make sure they had a say as well. And so in addition to the companies within the government, civil groups that are think tanks, experts on technology development, university leaders, we also made sure that we had civil rights groups, we had labor groups. I remember Aarti was on a roundtable with the Vice President, Harris, on getting all these folks together to make sure. And so the goal was, by the time the EO came out, people might disagree with this part or that part, but no one could say that they weren't consulted.
Yeah. Thoughts on that?
That was a
Additional
tour de
thoughts?
force. What he said. The thing I'll just add is why? Why is it so complicated? And I think there's a tendency, because of the way AI has been sold by the big AI companies, it's a conversation as if what matters is the model, OpenAI's model or Anthropic's model. That's not actually how AI is being used in the world. That's only one small slice of how it's being used in the world. And so if you shift from it is a thing to it is in everything, I think of it like software. I mean, more and more it's going to be embedded in, so it's already embedded in so many places, and there's so many more parts of our lives that it's going to come into. If we get it right, that's going to be great. But that's why it's not just one simple issue. That's why it is fraud and discrimination and worker impacts and safety issues and intellectual property issues. And so I think to me, it's not at all surprising that so many people had so many opinions about it. It's not surprising that executive order was as broad as it was. And when I look at what came out of it, I'll just say, look, what an executive order does is it says, obviously, the president's not changing the laws. What he is doing is putting priority on how the law is implemented. And so a lot of what that executive order did was say, hey, a lot of things that we don't like about AI's misuse happen to be illegal, but now we're going to figure out how to regulate and how to enforce against those harms. And so a lot of everyday experiences that people have with AI today, when your bank uses AI to evaluate your mortgage or loan application, when you get health care, when you receive what might be a fraudulent message or email, those are all examples of places where new regulations were put in place to make it clear that it's illegal to impersonate a person or an entity or government or bank to commit fraud, that healthcare systems can use AI, but only after they have made sure that they're not distilling all the imperfect decisions of our past, some of which in healthcare have been atrocious. That's what matters to me, is at the end of the day, it was actually starting to change people's everyday experiences with this technology.
Yeah. I guess just with regards to the executive order, I think one of the asks was also just kind of the safety test requirements that AI companies need to share. And in general, I think when having these sort of, call it like more significant asks of private companies, how did you guys think about the balance between transparency, safety, and then also concerns around competition, IP, and that kind of trade-off?
Yeah, so I could talk about that. And so the way we sequence this, and I think it's an important guide to how we think about further evolution in technology, is first, you talk to the companies and you say, well, what are you willing to do voluntarily? Because that can be a baseline. And like anything in life, you can try in the spirit of collaboration before you have to get to brass tacks. And there's always an element of both. And so the fact that all of these companies that we met with were willing to commit to safety testing, sharing the results, red teaming, which I'm sure many of you have talked about or done. That was very helpful because in the executive order, we ended up using authority under the Defense Production Act, which many of you may have heard for the first time during COVID, but it allows the government to intervene pretty directly in the economy on issues where there is a major defense or national security hook. And that includes during the pandemic, making sure that we can manufacture vaccines, get them to the right place, get to the front of the line when it comes to placing priority orders. So we redeveloped that muscle during the pandemic. It goes back decades, to the beginning of the Cold War. Harry Truman using some of those defense authorities, and often incurs a lot of legal challenges. And so I think when we did that and said, hey, companies, this is an issue of national concern, we need you to share these results with the government, they'd actually already committed to doing that. And the other interesting thing about that, and these are like the little nuances that can make or break a deal, is at least under the executive order, we said when you share that data, it can be confidential. Because what we simply want is to make sure if these advances are happening, and actually the companies are the ones, there's a lot of hype around AI, and it's always hard to distinguish what is truth and what is hype. But of course, the companies have a vested interest in saying this is going to be the greatest thing ever, and it may be. But if that's the case, then you always want somebody in the government watching and looking out for the public interest, even if it's not going to be on the national news every night, what you're developing with your model. So the question going forward is if and when there is regulation at the state and the federal level, what do the companies have to do? Because if you get enough people out there, there may be some actors who are less committed to this process of building trust. And then to the extent that they are willing to disclose, what happens privately and what happens publicly. And you see this challenge in other contexts too, when there's a major cyber attack or cyber breach, and we're all familiar with getting those emails saying change your password, it's on the dark web, and often we just ignore them because it's the 10th email of that we've gotten in the last several months. But basically, oftentimes disclosure is the right way to go, and so I can imagine there being a tension there, and that's the importance of public policy, is how to navigate those trade-offs.
Yeah, I want to touch on one thing you said in terms of hype versus what's real. And Arthi, we were also just sharing how you were probably the most senior government official who was actually an engineer in the room as well.
I think that's
when we were
probably
chatting
true,
right before this as well. And you've also been through so many technology waves as well. How do you feel like policymakers should think about distinguishing what's kind of hype versus an actual breakthrough, and what's kind of like the framework you recommend as well?
I want to answer that. I want to tag one thing onto what Vivek said, because I think it's important to step back on this regulation conversation and say that if you look in aggregate at the constraints, regulations, laws about AI, state level, federal level, in aggregate, there's barely anything, right? We have a few requirements that are typically about transparency. And I know there's a lot of complaining in Silicon Valley about how it's inhibiting innovation. I actually can't identify a single dollar that hasn't been invested in AI because of anyone's concern. If anyone knows an example, I'd actually be quite interested to learn about it. And I think we have to be clear that when you look at polling and you see that Americans are actually, they're enthusiastic and fearful, but fear actually continues to outpace hope when Americans are asked about AI. And I don't think that's separate from the fact that social media harms have not been dealt with over all of these decades that this has been rolling out into people's lives. So we actually still have a lot of work to do as a country, and I think it is going to impede business prospects unless we actually get this right. So I think the work is still very much out ahead of us. How do you get technical ground truth? Well, that's hard enough even when you understand the technology, and it's somewhat harder if you don't. But I think the issue really is about just the common sense questions of who are you hearing from? If you sit in your office in Washington, D.C., you're only going to hear from the people who decide to get on a plane and come see you, or have enough money to hire lobbyists to come see you. It's important to get out of your office and go find people who aren't those folks. I used to make sure I got out here and talked with VCs and entrepreneurs who weren't sitting in Washington in our office. I think you have to have a critical stance about what you're hearing. You know, if you hear something from a company, you need to remember that they are in the business of making money, that they're not in the business of providing you with a holistic perspective. They're marketing whatever the perspective is that works for them. And I think a little bit of, just having a little exercise in common sense is a good place to start. And I think just exactly as Vivek said, one thing I really loved was the fact that the vice president and the president went out of their way to make sure that we were hearing from experts and critics and people in academia who deeply understood AI, and civil rights organizations and labor organizations and consumer protection organizations, because those are the voice of the public. And you can't just, industry would love you to believe that since they are the only ones smart enough to make AI, they're the only ones smart enough to tell you what to do about it. Like, you just have to say that pegs my BS meter and go talk to everyone else. So.
Yeah. So maybe just on the labor groups, I do feel like for a lot of Americans, worker displacement is a big concern when it comes to AI. And what were some of the conversations you guys were having around AI and jobs? And I guess, like, what policies did you push for? Like, what are your thoughts on what still needs to happen there?
Yeah, so that's a good question, because there's a lot that still needs to happen. And most people don't have a great sense just yet of what that is. Because whenever you're aiming at a target where the target keeps moving, because we don't know how this technology is going to evolve, that's always an issue. But it starts with recognizing that you have a challenge in front of you, that the anxiety that Aarti mentioned that are in these polls is real. And some of that anxiety predates the latest explosion of AI discussion that we've all been part of. You all must remember Andrew Yang's campaign in 2019 and 2020 for presidency, which got a lot of traction. And he had many proposals out there, including the universal basic income. But one undercurrent of it was, what is the future of work? How do I get show that I can contribute and be valuable to society at a time when everything is changing around me? And I just went to a conference just last week where somebody said, my daughter is 14 years old. I don't actually even know what to tell her to study in college or advise her, where is the world going? And so I think we're at a really uncertain point. The good news is, we in government and business, it's always been hard to predict the future, right? And so you can have some guesses, but really what you want to do, like so many things in life, is plan for contingencies and various possible futures rather than just going toward one. And so it does mean, though, that just going to the same tired answers, everyone needs to learn to code. Well, guess what? It turns out these AI tools are very good at coding. Everyone needs to study this course or that course. That's a lot harder. And so what we did in the administration was, one, we said, let's at least get the right people in the room, get their hands around this. Let's talk to the unions and the union leaders and their members who are dealing with this firsthand, and recognize that you can never have the world stand still. Things are always going to change. And then you want to be, to your point about these reports that the companies are submitting to the government, maybe they don't want to, but you really need to make sure you have a view of the situation, because if things are happening in specific fields, you want to make sure that you get ahead of it and can do something about it. Now, what that is hard to say, because some of you may have read the work of Daron Acemoglu, Nobel Prize winner in economics, and he's pointed out, we typically, some people look at automation as a bad thing and say, hey, the way that we load things, for containers at ports, there should always be humans involved in that. Other people say anything you can automate, do automate it. We'll just redistribute the gains from efficiency after the fact, which of course runs into our political system. But really what he pointed out is it depends on what type of automation that you're talking about. If you have an automation for a surgical tool that reduces the number of errors in the operating room, of course you're going to do that, even if there might be some changes in the job mix in the OR. On the other hand, if you have an automation that just makes the thing slightly better, maybe even 1% better, enough for the company to lay off the worker, set of workers, cause destruction and chaos in communities and in our economy, but not actually increase overall GDP all that much, maybe that's not a trade that you want to make. And so making those types of calculations, it's hard. It can't be reduced to a formula, but that's why we need good public policy, policymakers, engineers, civil rights experts, labor leaders, all in the room together watching this, because this is the one question where everybody's scared, everybody's concerned, and nobody really has a great answer right now.
I want to add on to that as well. Part of the reason that there's not a lot of confidence is the waves of automation that did lead to job displacement, it was automation as well as offshoring, we didn't really do a great job with. And I mean, the economy did fine, wealth grew for the wealthy, but if you look across our country, there's so many regions of our country that have been hollowed out, so many people for whom not only did they lose a job, but they lost their identity, often if they were manufacturing workers, for example. So I don't think we covered ourselves with glory in that shift, and that's why I think we have to learn from that and do better as this shift happens, because I do think there's a lot of hype in AI. I do think that it's going to bring productivity to a wide variety of business functions, and it's not just going to be blue-collar workers that are displaced. There are many things you can do to help with that. Sometimes it's about protecting workers, but sometimes it's about helping workers who've been displaced by automation for all the good productivity reasons to find better jobs, or to figure out how to use that technology to what you really want, right, is for people to be able to use AI to do more and earn more. I don't know if that part's happening.
Yeah. So maybe we could touch a little bit more on that, on some of the possibilities of AI. I know you've spoken before on just AI applied to education, for instance, whether it's like personalized learning, supporting teachers. Like, what do you feel like that future could look like and should look like?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, in general, I would say I think our AI conversation is really completely dominated by business productivity applications. It's what the market's going to make money on. It's what people are starting companies to do. And we have to get it right. We've talked about all the issues. We've got a lot of work to do there. But of course, we want those productivity enhancements. I'm a little bored. Like, if we're just going to do more of the same stuff but more efficiently, that doesn't seem like it's enough if this is supposed to be the greatest technology of all time. And there is a lot more. And I think it's very worth reaching for. Education's a great place to start. EdTech tools, lots of EdTech companies are using AI to make even better EdTech tools. And one of the very few things we all agree on in terms of what works for improving learning for kids is personalizing it, is meeting them where they are and helping them on their journey in a very individualized way. Something that is so costly to do with a human tutor that as a practical matter, most kids don't get that kind of personalized tutoring. Maybe people who end up at Stanford got it, but in general, people don't get that. So here comes AI. It looks like it might be a way to completely change the cost equation for something that we know could be a big deal. Does that mean it's automatically going to reach every kid in every classroom? No. I mean, we've had really effective EdTech tools for a few decades now. They've been telling me they're going to close educational gaps for our kids. Has not happened. We've made essentially no progress, and now we've had a huge setback during the pandemic. So here the challenge that I'm seeing isn't just making a good AI EdTech tool. I am 100% sure we're going to have really great tools. What I am very concerned about, and what I think we have to roll up our sleeves and work on, is how do we make sure that school systems can find tools that protect privacy, are safe for students, aren't just chatbots in the wild that have led to horrible outcomes for kids, including suicide in some cases. How do we make sure that that personalized learning is meeting kids and teachers where they are, and it's not just turning into another thing on the to-do list for teachers. Every teacher I have ever talked to about educational technology says, oh, they keep giving me another thing I have to do. That's just not going to work. So if we can get this right, I think the potential is huge. But again, this is back to public and private. This is a public responsibility. If you tear down the Department of Education, you stop the funding for critical funding from the federal level that was supporting special education needs. That sounds like it's for a few kids. It's like 20 or 25% of our kids that have special educational needs. If we're not reaching those kids, if we're not getting the funding in place, if we're not helping school systems pick and then implement these new AI EdTech tools, we're just going to leave so much opportunity for these kids on the table.
Other areas on just possibilities of AI that we aren't spending
so
as
many,
much
so
time on.
many.
I noticed you have spoken in the past on AI applied to climate and weather prediction as well.
So that's one of many, many areas. The first wall to break is Today, again, the conversation about AI is dominated by large language models. I'll just say a decade ago when I was running DARPA, we were using machine learning, this current generation of AI technology, for so many things, managing the radio spectrum, all kinds of automation. But a decade ago, what we were saying is, it doesn't really seem to have made that much difference for natural language processing. And it turns out no one had yet done the amount of compute and data. That's the big breakthrough that now has put AI in front of everyone instead of being behind the scenes. It's now a chatbot and an image generator that you can interact with. But I want to make sure we don't get stuck. Language is delightful, it's what we speak, but it is not the whole game by any stretch of the imagination. One of the big dreams for AI has been the idea that you can use it to generate new medicines. And if you followed AlphaFold, which was a DeepMind AI model trained on biological data, this was biological data in the protein data bank that had been researched on public funds, curated and collected and maintained with public funds over many decades, also at risk today. That's what they used to train their model on. It did something that was a holy grail of biology, which was predict protein folding and the structure of a protein from the sequence of amino acids. No one ever thought that was going to be possible, and they did it. So it's astonishing, it's great. That's one step on the road to being able to design a potentially interesting molecule for a medicine. So that's good news. There are companies that are plowing into that, venture and other investment that's going into that. Here's the problem is if you just generate a better molecule, you still have to go through clinical trials in the FDA process. And so you can build a better molecule that's not a medicine until you finish this whole public sector responsibility, which is clinical trials for safety and efficacy. So the holy grail I'm interested in is what would it take to have AI technologies that changed and improved the clinical trial process, but also collapsed it in time. You can start to imagine a future where you could have drugs for diseases that seem intractable, and you could have them in months rather than decades. That would be. I want my girls to grow up in a future where that is possible, where they don't have to worry about things like Alzheimer's. That's just inconceivable today, but it could become possible.
Vivek, maybe a question for you. So Aarti shared a couple applications of AI that kind of seem like obvious wins where AI could do sort of tremendous good, whether it's education, healthcare, medicine. What are your thoughts in terms of where government needs to lead versus follow? And just with these sort of new emerging technologies, where should government think about regulating? Where should it think about getting out of the way?
Yeah, so I would say there's a category of issues where if the market is very well developed, if norms or regulations are in place and they seem to be working, those are the places where government may not have to focus as much. So if AI is being used in new, novel ways to help Netflix predict what you want to watch next better than Disney Plus, government, it would be nice to know what's going on, but you don't have to worry about things like that. I think the two areas that we touched on, but where I spend the most time thinking about are, on the one hand, are these technologies going to be used often unwittingly because, as the companies themselves will say, they often don't fully understand how these technologies work. And even for the language model specifically, there's a whole science of what they call interpretability to try to get under the hood to say what they're actually predicting. But to Aarti's point, if the technology is being used to make mortgage decisions, and those are made in a way that harm some people rather than others for reasons that are not immediately clear, that could be a problem. Or one thing that I remember in this session that we had with the vice president and the president in the Roosevelt Room, there was a big focus on seniors and how often we read in the newspaper about people who specifically prey on elderly Americans with scams, saying, hey, your granddaughter is in big trouble, you need to wire your life savings right now. Something like this was always a problem, but now with voice impersonation, where they can impersonate the voice of your granddaughter and say, she's going to be harmed or killed unless you wire this money, something like that needs to be regulated. And so that's on the bias, discrimination, fraud, deception. And if you look at what Aarti talked about, the mix of hope and skepticism around AI issues generally. One of my other jobs in the White House was helping to oversee the policy development for the State of the Union, where any conceivable issue can be included or possibly be included. So you're looking at everything, and you're looking at a lot of public opinion data. And the things that were actually always at the top of the list when it came to public opinion, there was a lot of concern for veterans and making sure that people who served the country were taken care of. But right up there was making sure that if you subscribe to something and you try to cancel it, and those folks who make you get on the phone and wait for an hour to go through it, people hate that stuff. And they hate being taken advantage of. They hate being exploited. And so there's a lot of demand if these technologies take off in a way where more of that is happening rather than less, that's a problem. And then the other issue is, of course, around harm at a larger scale. And even putting aside the narratives around how AI is going to destroy us all, and you've probably all heard about people talking about their probability of doom. I remember actually right after Arthi went to the Oval Office, showed the president ChatGPT for the first time and explained to him how it works. And they had to get special dispensation because it's actually a classified environment, so you typically can't bring in anything other than a very special computer in there. So they figured that out. But right after that, Arthi briefed the entire cabinet in the Roosevelt Room on these technologies and both how they worked as well as the guardrails. And so just for a test case, one of the people typed in, "Help me make a nuclear weapon," or "Help me make a bioweapon." And of course, the system was trained well enough. It said, "Hey, I can't do that for you. I'm sorry, I can't help you." But you can imagine as people get more sophisticated and getting around those guardrails, if somebody could manufacture something like the COVID-19 virus, which basically took down the global economy for quite some time, and they can do that with the assistance of one of these tools, that's something where you'd want to be pretty forward and making sure you have a sense of exactly what's going on. And even if you can't, some people will say, well, it's simply these tools are evolving, there's diffusion across the population, you can't stop that. And maybe at some point you can argue about whether that's the case, but right now, given what we've seen when technologies proliferate without regulation, that's something that you at least want to try to get your head around.
Okay, final question for me. What are you both most proud of accomplishing together? And also, what do you wish you could have done that still keeps you up at night?
You go first.
Sure. So I would say most proud of together. So there were all these things. You mentioned the executive order, the commitments, but I think, I guess I would say two things together. One is to this point about making sure as many voices were in the room as possible. I worked together with Arthi, put together a panel up in San Francisco for the president to meet with a range of leaders on AI and really hear from them directly. And of course, he'd heard from the companies. We'd mentioned there were separate meetings with civil rights leaders, with labor leaders. This was simply a meeting of people who, including professors at Stanford, people who spend their lives thinking about this technology. Of course, I'm sure many of them may have a profit motive, but their primary motive wasn't simply to get as many users as possible. It was how can we actually make this work for people? So we had, I know some of you may have taken Rob Reish's class. I know it's someone Ernestine and I also know and have worked with. We had Jennifer Doudna, who was the co-inventor of CRISPR. She was there in the panel. And we had a number of people from other places, and just with Arthi moderating, making sure that the president could hear very directly from these folks, ask them very difficult questions, and have a back and forth at a time when all of these questions that we're talking about were just exploding all around us. That was a really important thing. And I think the second thing is actually what you asked Arthi about, and she spoke about, which was this idea of AI aspirations that Arthi coined and ended up having a whole event around it sponsored by the White House, because everybody, when we talk about this technology, it's either hype or it's going nowhere. It's good or it's bad. And I think what we all try to do, and what I imagine so many of you are thinking about is, well, there are these consequences that we've talked about that we have to be aware of, but at the same time, there are some amazing things that we can do. And one of the things the government can do, because we talked in the beginning about basic science, government can fund basic research that other companies aren't necessarily going to do. You can coordinate, break silos. It's something that Arthi helped with the Cancer Moonshot Initiative, which was a big priority for the administration. You can help with the initial scale up when it comes to manufacturing or development, because there's often that valley of death before commercialization. But another thing you can do is just set really big, bold, important targets for what might be possible and help orient people around some of the most interesting and important causes. And I think that was something that we worked together on elevating and having the president speak directly about. To your question about what keeps me up or what do I regret, the EO came out on Halloween in 2023. I remember people joking, we want to scare everybody, but it actually wasn't that scary. So that was 2 years ago. You know, we had another year in DC, and now it's been another year since then. And I would have liked to think, given the bipartisan interest in this issue, that there would be some type of basic regulatory or legal scheme around it, preferably bipartisan, preferably passed. Remember the old thing where Congress used to pass a law and then the president would sign it?
Yeah,
It doesn't seem to happen that much anymore, but seeing some actual legislating would have been very helpful. And there was a whole discussion, many of you may have followed in the last couple of months, about whether the federal government should impose a moratorium and preempt AI regulation at the state level. And whatever you think of that proposal, I think most folks would agree that having a strong federal regulatory and legal scheme would be much better than having these patchwork of proposals by state. The problem is that they wanted to replace something, whether in California or New York or Texas or wherever, with nothing, saying, we're gonna stop you from doing what you're doing, but we're not really gonna put out a strong governing scheme ourselves. And so my hope is that as the technology evolves, Democrats and Republicans who clash on so many other issues can come together, because the concerns that Aarti referenced in public opinion are bipartisan. The hopes for cancer, for weather, for education are bipartisan. So there's no reason why the legislation and the regulation can't be somewhat bipartisan as well.
My list of what I'm really grateful to get to participate in sounds exactly like Vivek's list, which is why we loved working together so much. But I do think showing that you can get AI started on the right track is something in ways that actually change Americans' day-to-day interactions with the technology. That's something I'm very proud of. You mentioned Cancer Moonshot. The work we did, if fully implemented, will save millions of lives over the next the years ahead, and those are a lot of families that are affected. We started scaling clean energy technologies at a scale that the climate actually notices, which gave me hope for the first time that we could meet the climate crisis. These are all examples of things that are not on the right track today. And the thing I'm saddest about is, what I really want to focus my work on today, I think too many of our fellow Americans have not really seen or have forgotten that this country can do astonishing things when we pull together. And so many of the things that we want for ourselves and for our kids, they aren't partisan matters. They are really about thriving with better health and having more opportunities, not just here in 94301, but across the country, and continuing to have a strong leadership position in the world economically and from a national security perspective. So I think, to me, part of the healing that our country needs to go through, a part of the healing I think will happen as we find places to come together and reinvigorate taking on these big things, because I think that will build our confidence about how our democracy works.
Great. Thank you both for joining us here today.
Thank you so much.
It's been amazing to hear these two stories. This is the first time I've been able to interact with Aarti or Vivek. And really two stories here. One is the story about expertise meeting service. And thinking about all the things that they've been able to do because they took the time to learn a discipline, and then they had the heart to go and apply it. And it's a story, I think, for everyone here, whether you are in health or artificial intelligence or energy or education, all stories that we heard about in detail this evening, there's a chance to be able to go and apply that expertise that you're learning here at Stanford, what you've learned before, and what you're going to learn next. The second story that really struck me from your comments is about the nature of this class, Silicon Valley and the US government. In fact, you mentioned toward the end this idea of a bipartisan approach to things, and this is really even a nonpartisan, I would say, type of thing for Silicon Valley, which is a shorthand for private sector, oftentimes, and the U.S. government, the public sector, bringing those two together in ways that are absolutely essential for the age we live in now. Each of us gets to be a part of that if we choose. So as we look out at these students and what you've done, imagine yourselves having been able to serve in these types of capacities. Really, it begins with just raising your hand. Raising your hand to go offer the chance to go serve, to leave the private sector, to go to the public sector, or to come from the public sector, to go build in the private sector. Whatever it is, thank you both for sharing your experiences, your story arcs here, and for all the service you've rendered in both of these settings. Real role models for everyone here. So thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ernestine.